Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at Arthur Conan Doyle's first book in the Sherlock Holmes series, A Study in Scarlet. Arthur Conan Doyle was one of the greatest detective writers ever. Sherlock Holmes is a quintessential detective in all of literary history. We're going to be taking a look at his first book, A Study in Scarlet. I'm also going to compare it to the BBC adaptation that came out a couple of years ago with Benedict Cumberbatch embodying the quintessential character. So we're going to try and learn a couple different things, not necessarily what the book itself has to say, but some of the ways that modern adaptations can help us write for more modern audiences. That's not to say that what was written there has no value, but there are ways that we express things today that writers back then express things differently. One of the things with this book is that the first part is actually solving the crime itself, and the second half is actually describing the reasoning behind why the villain actually did the things that he did. A lot of the second part has a lot to do not in what happens in the UK, but rather what happens in Utah. So, let's get into it. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. No, I have no idea what he intends to go in for. I believe he is well up in anatomy, and he is a first-class chemist, but as far as I know, he has never taken out any systematic medical classes. His studies are desultory and eccentric, but he has amassed a lot of out-of-the-way knowledge, which would astonish his professors. One of the big differences between the BBC adaptation and the book is that in the BBC adaptation, they rely more on Sherlock Holmes' awareness and attention to detail, whereas in the book, he relies more on his history of cases and drawing parallels with previous cases to draw out the information that he wants. A number of times in the book, he actually refers back to other cases that he's read about in the past and said, hey, this situation is like this, so we should be able to find the person who committed this crime like this. And he uses this out of the way information to find out who the suspect is. That doesn't necessarily work nowadays because a lot of the detectives already have that type of information. So, in order to set the character of Sherlock Holmes apart from the detectives, they went with a more attention to detail and noticing different things. Now, this means is that there's a lot more guessing in the deduction that Sherlock Holmes does, but it is presented in such a way where it is seemed as almost absolute truth. In the end, what he is doing in the BBC series, and when we're talking about deductions in general, is that we're studying patterns and seeing how the patterns point to a specific outcome or a specific idea. The problem is that's not always going to be the case. What's shown in the BBC series as well as the book is that they don't actually show the probability of it falling against Sherlock Holmes. This is kind of showing the idea of, hey, what his deductions are so perfect that he actually doesn't have the problems that other detectives would have. Now, there are a number of other ways that they talk about there are a number of different ways that the book is also different from the TV series. One specifically is the use of technology, but we'll get into that a little bit later. He is sure to be at the laboratory, returned my companion. He either avoids the place for weeks, or else he works there from morning to night. If you like, we shall drive around together after luncheon. Why, man, this is the most practical medical legal discovery in years. You don't see that it gives us an infallible test for bloodstains. Come over here now. Something that's also not mentioned is the fact that Sherlock Holmes is also an inventor. They don't really discuss it in any of the adaptations. He actually helps create different methods of testing for blood. One of the things that's mentioned in the book is he actually says that sometimes what can end up happening is that you have different stains on coats or clothes or items, and you want to test to see if it's actually blood. In this time period, the Victorian era, They didn't have the tests that we have today. So it makes sense why they actually omitted this as part of the character in the TV series. I have to be careful, he continued, turning to me with a smile, for I dabble with poisons a good deal. He held out his hand as he spoke. I noticed that it was all mottled with similar pieces of plaster and discolored with strong acids. Here we're also seeing another aspect where he's actually testing on himself. This shows us the willingness of Sherlock Holmes to find out the truth and set up himself with the knowledge required to do the job that he wants to do. This is a man of singular focus. Let me see. What are my other shortcomings? I get in the dumps at times and don't open my mouth for days on end. You must not think I am sulky when I do that. Just let me alone and I will soon be right. What have you to confess now? It's just as well for two fellows to know the worst of one another before they begin to live together. This is actually something that's actually mentioned in the BBC series, where they actually discuss some of the issues. Now, what they're talking about here is not necessarily what ends up in the BBC series. The reason for this is because it doesn't make a lot of sense for a TV series where there requires very much faster pace where you can't necessarily skip. But they got rid of this because the suspense needs to be high for a TV series, a detective series. Tension is one of those things when we're talking about a detective series, is that they want to build up the tension. And you can't necessarily have that if your detective is actually sulking around all the time. Now, this makes sense in the book because you can skip a lot of this and it's not necessarily an issue. You just have a single line of dialogue or single line of exposition and you've covered this. But if the TV series or a movie, you can't do this because you actually have to show this, and this sucks up timing and it can ruin the pacing. Oh, what a mystery it is, I cried, rubbing my hands. This is very piquant. I am much obliged for you for bringing us together. The proper study of mankind is man, you know. You must study him then, Sandford said, as he bid me goodbye. You'll find him in a knotty problem, though. I'll wager he learns more about you than you about him. Goodbye. Goodbye, I answered, and strolled to my hotel, considerably interested in my new acquaintance. This isn't a one-sided part of learning about what's going on. This gives us an understanding of what Watson is like. He is finding something to occupy his time. In the book, he's extremely bored because he just came out of Afghanistan. Now, this isn't the Afghanistan that we understand today, but another Afghan war that the UK was involved in during the Victorian era. It was actually a lot worse than what we saw during the early 2000s up until the withdrawal recently. So one of the things that we're giving here is we're giving a disposition of what the type of character Dr. Watson is. He's bored, and one of the ways that he is sucking up his time is by trying to study this odd man in Sherlock Holmes. On these occasions, I have noticed such a dreamy, vacant expression in his eyes that I might have been suspected him of being addicted to the use of some narcotic, had it not the temperance and the cleanliness of his whole life forbidden such a notion. This is an interesting change between the book and the TV series. The TV series, you actually see Sherlock Holmes as kind of a messy figure. This is something that we understand when we're talking about people who are more creative, or how us as viewers see people more creative. We tend to see people who are more creative or more intelligent as messy people. That's not always necessarily the case. But in the way that we have changed our perspective over the type of people that we see as intelligent, it has changed from the Victorian era to now. In height, he was rather over 6 feet, and so excessively lean he seemed to be considerably taller. His eyes were sharp and piercing, save for during intervals of torpor, which I have alluded, and his thin hawk-like nose gave his whole expression an air of alertness and decision. His chin, too, had the prominence and squareness of which marked the man of determination. His hands were invariably blotted with ink and stained with chemicals, yet he possessed an extraordinary delicacy of touch, as I frequently had occasion to observe when I watched him manipulate his fragile philosophical instruments. If we take a look at Benedict Cumberbatch, we can actually see how he actually fits this description quite well. This is actually a fantastic casting choice, but and also they actually found an actor who could play the character really well. My health forbade me from venturing out unless the weather was exceptionally genial, and I had no friends who could call upon me and break the monotony of my daily existence. Under these circumstances, I eagerly hailed the little mystery which hung around my companion, and spent much of my time in endeavoring to unravel it. In today's society, we have social media to suck up our time, but at that time, somebody who was unable to work, they had a lot of time on their hands. In the case of Dr. Watson, he had the money because of his military pension because he was injured, but he didn't have the strength to go out and work. One of the issues they had at the time is that the medical industry had not advanced to the point where it was easy to recover from certain injuries. In this time, injuries actually took a long time to recover from, typically because the nutrition wasn't necessarily up to par. That recovery is a slow process for them. In the Victorian era, they barely had enough food to actually provide for what they needed on a day-to-day basis, which means that when they got injured, it took a long time for them to recover. In addition to this, medications also play a part in how we recover from injuries. My surprise reached a climax, however, when I found, incidentally, that he was ignorant of Copernican theory and the composition of the solar system that any civilized human being in this 19th century would not be aware of, that the Earth traveled around the sun appeared to me such an extraordinary fact that I could hardly realize it. You appear to be astonished, he said, smiling at my expression of surprise. Now that I know it, I shall do my best to forget it. To forget it? You see, he explained, I consider that a man's brain originally a little empty attic, and that you have to stock it with such furniture as you choose. The fool takes it all in the lumber of very short that he comes across, so that the knowledge which he might be useful to him gets crowded out, or at best jumbled up with a lot of other things, so that he has difficulty on laying his hands upon it. Now a skillful workman is very clear indeed as to what he takes into his brain attic. Again, we're seeing an indication this man, Sherlock Holmes, is a man of singular disposition, whereas they have a singular focus on what's going on. One of the things that we struggle with today is that because of things like social media, our brains are inundated with so much information, so that if we actually took the time and actually parsed out the things that we actually need to do the job that we're looking to do, we actually will find that much of it will cause our understanding to become clouded. How much time do we spend on social media? How much time do we watch videos on the internet that have nothing to do with what we're looking to do? For me personally, I know that if I am not controlling the amount of time I spend on social media, I can waste hours and hours doing nothing but scrolling through things that have nothing to do with what I want to do. My goal is to be a writer, so I have to make sure that I partition my time so that I am allowing enough time to do what I need to do, and so that I am not wasting the rest of the time that I have, because I want to make sure that I'm getting better. Every person who is looking to do a job well has to keep this in mind. It is easy if we're talking about a job where you go off and do something and you're paying attention and you don't have the distractions. But if we're not careful, social media and other forms of interactions can severely be a hindrance to what we're trying to do. No man lives or has ever lived who has brought the same amount of study and natural talent to the detection of crime which I have done. And what is the result? There's no crime to detect. At most, some bungling villainy with a motive so transparent that even a Scotland Yard official can see through it. Again, we're seeing somebody who's devoted their entire lives to learning about criminality. This is something that he desires so much that he's actually seeing how to do what he wants to do, that he spent so much time in study, that he spent so much time learning about not just paying attention to what's going on around him, but learning the pertinent information to do the work, as well as the history of different cases that could help him solve the cases better. Holmes glanced at me and raised his eyebrows sardonically. With two such men as yourself and Lestrade upon the ground, there would not be much for a third party to find out, he said. Gregston rubbed his hands in self-centered, satisfied way. I think we have done all that can be done, he answered. It's a queer case, though, and I knew your tastes were for such things. You did not come here in a cab? Asked Sherlock Holmes. The reason I brought this particular quote up is because we need to keep in mind that the way that they talk during the Victoria era was actually quite different. So for in this case, you have the word queer. In the understanding of, at the time, queer actually just means odd. Now it's developed into something completely different, but this is something that we need to keep in mind in how we read older stories. It reminds me of the circumstances attendant on the death of Van Jansen in Urich in the year 34. Do you remember that case, Gregson? No, sir. Read up on it. You really should. There's nothing new under the sun. It all has been done before. So what the point here is the fact that there is new things that pop up, and the fact that he is mentioning this is that he has to grow into learning and understanding what is going on in this case that he's working with. Poison, said Sherlock Holmes curtly. He strode off. Another thing, Lestrade, he added, turning around the door. Reche is the German word for revenge, so don't lose your time looking for Miss Rachel. With much Parthian shot as he walked away, leaving the two rivals open-mouthed behind him. This is another difference I want to point out between the book and the TV series. In the TV series, it's actually mentioned by Anderson. Somebody else, I believe is supposed to be the Gregson, points out that Ritchie means German for revenge, but Sherlock Holmes dismisses it. Now, in the book, he dismisses it later on as a misdirection, which it actually is. But in the book, he actually mentions it and points it out. But this is done in a way to let him know that there is no Miss Rachel. Do you remember what Darwin said about music? He claims that the power of producing, appreciating it exists among the human race long before the power of speech has arrived at. Perhaps that is why we are so subtly influenced by it. There are vague memories in our souls that those misty centuries when the world was in its childhood. While this could be the case that because of our history as human race and development of music is affecting it, we do know that music does have an effect on the human brain, that playing certain types of music actually help younger children develop their brains and have a positive effect on the brain chemistry. This is one of the reasons why when writing, it's a good idea to actually try to use specific types of music to encourage your writing capabilities. Now, I have used music in my own writing and have a selected playlist that I listen to while writing. This is something that you should check out for yourself to see if this is something that would work for you. It's a rather broad idea, I remarked. One's ideas must be broad as nature if they are to interpret nature, he answered. What's the matter? You're not looking quite yourself. This Brixton Road affair has upset you. One of the things I wanted to point out in this case is the fact that when we're, as a writer, we need to make sure that we aren't being narrow in our perspective. Reality is not something that we can hold in our hand and expect to have a full understanding of it, but rather nature and reality and truth are ideas that we need to be seeking out constantly. It's so easy for us to get caught up in this idea that we have all the answers, that we have everything, but the reality is that what we have a perceived understanding of truth is just one side. We can easily fall into the trap that one cause is the true factor of everything. That if we are looking at it from a specific perspective, that there are no other factors that could be playing a part in how a result takes place. But that's not actually the case. The actual truth of the matter is that typically there are multiple factors that have a part in how things play out. There's an idea called perfect storm. Perfect storm is the idea where you have multiple causal factors in how the events, particularly in this case, a storm, takes place. You require multiple inputs for this storm to become an issue. Just like that, so are so many other factors that come out and play into how events take place. All of these factors should be present in our story, that we shouldn't just be relying on A plus B equals C, but rather A plus B plus C plus D equals Z. These are all factors that require certain elements to make things happen. We want to make it not necessarily more complicated, but you want to reflect the reality of what people have going on, while at the same time making it simple enough for people to understand and digest the information. To tell you the truth, I ought to be more case hardened after my Afghan experience. I saw my own comrades hacked to pieces by the Mahawan without losing my nerve. I can understand. There's a mystery about which stimulates the imagination. Where there is no imagination, there is no horror. One of the reasons I brought this particular quote up is because this last line, without imagination, there is no horror. This is something that can be applied to writing for horror stories or suspense. This is that we have to create this impending doom upon our readers by making them feel like a certain thing is going to happen, but not actually show this thing. One of the great sci-fi horror movies of our time, the movie Aliens, the director made it a point, and Steven Spielberg is actually known for this as well, making it a point of not showing the whole object of fear. So for instance, in the movie Alien, you don't see the xenomorph pretty much at all during the whole movie, with the exception at the end. The same thing with the movie Jaws. They make it a very poignant part to make sure that you actually aren't seeing the shark in any real fashion until much, much later. And even then, you're only showing bits and pieces of it. This creates a sense of suspense. This creates a sense of impending doom in the minds of our watchers and readers. This is something that we keep in mind in our writing, is that we're trying to create specific feelings in our readers so that we can have the events play out in the way that we want them to play out. All right. In the end, one of the things I want to leave you with is that we need to be paying attention to how much time we're spending on making our stories and how much time we're actually spending on the miscellaneous things that come into our world. It's so easy to get caught up into the day-to-day that we are wasting the time that we have to actually get our stories written, as well as honing our skills. These are all things that take time. So when we're wasting our time on social media, we end up causing ourselves more heartache than we actually really need to. These are ways that we are causing ourselves delays in our writing. What I highly encourage every writer to do is to take a look at their own lives and figuring out what can be cut, particularly starting with social media. There are a number of different programs. I use one called Cold Turkey, where you can actually use to actually limit how much time you have access to those programs or those sites on the internet. This way you can make sure that you're not actually wasting your own time. As creatives, we tend to be a lot more wasteful and less paying attention to what needs to be done. We're easily distracted. So these are some of the things I just wanted to leave you with. And that's all I had for today. As always, I will be linking all the resources I have in the description below. If you have any questions, concerns, please leave them in the comment section below. Until next time, bye. I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.